The doctor's hand froze over the life support switch, his confident stride suddenly halted by a low, menacing growl that seemed to rise from the depths of hell itself. The German shepherd's amber eyes blazed with an intelligence that defied explanation, his massive frame positioned protectively across the motionless chest of Deputy Sheriff Tom Mitchell. This wasn't supposed to happen. The patient was dead. Martha Mitchell's coffee cup shattered against the hospital floor, the elderly woman's trembling fingers unable to maintain their grip as she witnessed her son's loyal partner defy death itself. Sarah Chen Mitchell gasped, her veterinary training telling her one thing while her heart whispered something entirely different. The wedding ring on Tom's finger caught the fluorescent light. The same ring he'd worn for 20 years, through good times and divorce, through loneliness and hope. Now Ranger stood sentinel over dreams that seemed buried forever. "Security to ICU immediately," the doctor barked into his radio, his medical certainty cracking like ice on a frozen pond. But what did this remarkable dog sense that modern medicine had missed? And could love truly transcend the boundaries between life and death? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the morning mist still clung to the rolling hills of Millbrook, Tennessee, like a grandmother's embrace that refused to let go. In this town of 300 souls, where the biggest excitement usually came from the annual Corn Festival and Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses, everybody knew your business before you did. Main Street stretched lazily between Martha's Diner and the First Baptist Church, lined with antique shops that had seen better decades and rocking chairs that had witnessed 3 generations of gossip. Deputy Sheriff Tom Mitchell emerged from his modest farmhouse at exactly 5:15 a.m., same as he had every morning for the past 5 years. At 45, his weathered face told stories of 2 decades protecting folks who'd watched him grow from a scrawny kid into the man they trusted with their lives. His salt and pepper hair was always neatly trimmed, his uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass, and his quiet strength spoke louder than the loudest sermon Father Mackenzie ever delivered. Beside him trotted Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd whose distinguished service record read like something from a movie script. The massive dog bore the scars of heroism, a distinctive white patch over his left eye and a graying muzzle that had once pulled 12 survivors from the smoking ruins of the World Trade Center. When the NYPD retired him, Tom had driven 800 miles to New York City, knowing in his bones that this particular dog needed a particular kind of home. Their morning routine was sacred. 5-mile run through the countryside, past the old tobacco barns and Martha's vegetable garden, where Ranger would steal tomatoes if Tom wasn't watching. Then coffee and biscuits at Martha's Diner, where Mabel would slip Ranger bacon under the table and pretend she hadn't. Martha Mitchell, Tom's 72-year-old mother, ruled the family homestead with an iron fist wrapped in flour-dusted aprons. The former schoolteacher had buried her husband 15 years ago, but never lost her gift for reading people's hearts. She spoiled Ranger shamelessly, claiming the dog had more sense than most folks she'd taught. Her arthritis made climbing stairs difficult, but she'd never admit it, and her occasional memory lapses worried Tom more than he let on. 2 years of divorce papers couldn't erase the fact that Sarah Chen Mitchell still answered when Tom called. The accomplished veterinarian had built a thriving practice in Nashville, but she'd also built walls around her heart. She'd loved Tom enough to marry him, but not enough to compete with his hero complex forever. Their split had been quiet and civil, like everything else in Tom's life, but it left holes that even Ranger's devotion couldn't fill. This morning felt different somehow. Ranger's ears stayed alert during their run, and he kept glancing back at Tom with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to see everything. If Tom had paid closer attention, he might have noticed his partner's unusual restlessness. but he was thinking about the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table and wondering if pride was worth eating beans for dinner again. The radio crackled to life at exactly 7:23 a.m., shattering the peaceful morning like a rock through church windows. All units, we have a 211 in progress at Millbrook First National. Suspect is armed and considered extremely dangerous. Vehicle description: blue pickup truck, Tennessee plates, Charlie Delta 749. Tom's coffee cup hit the patrol car's dashboard as he flipped on the sirens. Ranger's ears shot forward in the back seat, his body instantly alert to the change in his partner's demeanor. The German Shepherd had ridden shotgun through enough emergencies to recognize the signs. The tightening of Tom's jaw, the white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, the way his breathing shifted from relaxed to razor-focused. "Unit 12 responding," Tom radioed back, his Crown Victoria already screaming down Main Street past startled shopkeepers opening their stores. In the rearview mirror, he caught Ranger's amber eyes watching him with that uncanny intelligence that sometimes made Tom wonder if the dog could read his thoughts. The chase began at the town square and wound through residential streets where children should have been walking to school. Tom's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the blue pickup weave between parked cars, tires squealing against asphalt that had never seen this kind of violence. The suspect was driving like a man with nothing left to lose, and those were always the most dangerous kind. What Tom didn't know was that Earl Jackson sat behind that wheel, his calloused hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel with desperate intensity. At 52, Earl looked like he'd aged 20 years in the past 5. His hollow cheeks and bloodshot eyes told the story of a man who'd lost everything that mattered and was still falling. Earl's pickup truck contained exactly $347 stolen from the bank's teller drawer, a half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels, and a crumpled photograph of an 8-year-old girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Katie Jackson had been dead for 5 years, but Earl still carried her picture everywhere, still talked to it during the long, sleepless nights when the guilt ate at him like cancer. The house fire had started with Earl's cigarette. He'd fallen asleep drunk on the couch while his wife Emma was working the night shift at the hospital, and Katie was upstairs dreaming of ponies and birthday parties. By the time the smoke woke him, the flames had already claimed the stairway. He'd tried to reach his daughter, screaming her name until his lungs burned, but the ceiling collapsed before he could get to her room. Emma never forgave him. She died 3 years later, and Earl knew it was from a broken heart, not the cancer the doctors blamed. Now he lived rough in the Tennessee hills, stealing when he had to, drinking when he could afford it, and visiting Katie's grave every Sunday with whatever flowers he could find or steal. Today's robbery hadn't been planned. Earl had driven to town to buy a proper bouquet for Katie's birthday. She would have turned 13 today. But when he'd reached for his wallet, it was empty. The desperation had hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly he was standing in the bank with a crowbar in his hand, demanding money for flowers for a dead little girl. The chase wound up into the foothills, past abandoned farms and rusted mailboxes that marked dreams long dead. Earl's truck finally gave out near the old mill, steam pouring from its radiator like the last breath of a dying animal. He stumbled out of the cab, still clutching the crowbar, and disappeared into the thick woods that had hidden Confederate deserters more than a century ago. Tom parked 50 yards away and checked his weapon. "Stay here, boy," he told Ranger, his voice carrying the authority that had kept him alive through 2 decades of police work. "I'll be right back." But Ranger's whine carried a note Tom had never heard before, high and anxious, like a mother's warning cry. The dog's ears were flat against his head, and his powerful body trembled with an energy that had nothing to do with excitement. If Tom had been a different kind of man, he might have listened to that warning. If he'd trusted his partner's instincts over his training, everything might have ended differently. Instead, Tom checked his radio one last time and entered the woods, following broken branches and scattered leaves that marked Earl's desperate flight. Behind him, Ranger's whines grew more frantic, and his claws scratched against the car window like he was trying to claw his way through steel and glass to reach his partner. The forest closed around Tom like a green cathedral, all dappled sunlight and ancient silence. Somewhere ahead, a broken man waited with a crowbar and nothing left to lose. Earl Jackson crouched behind a fallen oak tree, his breathing ragged and his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the crowbar. The metal felt cold and foreign in his palms, nothing like the service weapon he'd carried for 15 years before everything went to hell. Through the gaps in the rotting bark, he could see the deputy moving carefully through the underbrush, weapon drawn, eyes scanning the forest with the methodical precision of a man who'd done this dance too many times. The sight of that uniform hit Earl like a sledgehammer to the chest. It wasn't this particular deputy who'd chased him the night Katie died. Hell, he couldn't even remember their faces anymore through the haze of whiskey and grief. But the uniform was the same. The careful movements were the same. And suddenly Earl was back in that courtroom 5 years ago, listening to some prosecutor explain how his reckless endangerment had contributed to his daughter's death. Tom Mitchell advanced through the woods with the patience of a man who understood that haste killed more cops than bullets. His eyes swept left and right, cataloging every shadow, every break in the natural pattern of leaves and branches. 20 years of experience had taught him to read the forest like a book, and right now every page screamed danger. He'd dealt with desperate men before, farmers who'd lost their land, fathers who couldn't feed their families, veterans who'd come home broken from wars that never should have been fought. Most of them just needed someone to listen, someone to see them as human beings instead of problems to be solved. But the man he was tracking felt different somehow, charged with the kind of electricity that came from having nothing left to lose. Behind the oak tree, Earl's vision blurred as memories crashed over him like waves. Katie's laugh echoing through their old house. Emma's hand in his during their wedding dance. The smell of smoke and the sound of sirens and his own voice screaming his daughter's name until his throat bled. The uniforms had been everywhere that night. Fire department, police, paramedics, all of them trying to save what couldn't be saved. "I know you're out here," Tom called softly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of talking people down from ledges both literal and metaphorical. "Whatever's going on, we can work it out. Nobody has to get hurt today." The words might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. Earl's world had narrowed to a tunnel of rage and grief, and at the end of that tunnel stood another uniform, another reminder of the night his life ended. His grip tightened on the crowbar until his knuckles turned white. Tom moved closer, following the trail of broken twigs and disturbed earth that marked his quarry's passage. His radio crackled softly on his shoulder, backup units coordinating their search pattern, but he barely heard them. Something about this felt wrong, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect symphony. The attack came without warning. Earl erupted from behind the fallen tree like a man possessed, the crowbar whistling through the air with lethal intent. "You bastards took everything from me," he screamed, his voice cracking with 5 years of accumulated pain. "Everything!" Tom's training kicked in, muscle memory honed by thousands of hours of practice. He tried to bring his weapon up, tried to create distance, tried to de-escalate a situation that had already exploded beyond control. But Earl's desperation gave him speed, and the heavy iron caught Tom across the left temple with a sound like a melon hitting concrete. The world tilted sideways, and Tom felt himself falling, though it seemed to take forever. He hit the forest floor with a wet thud, blood already pooling beneath his head, soaking into leaves that had been green and alive just moments before. His vision grayed at the edges, consciousness flickering like a candle in a hurricane. Through the gathering darkness he could hear Earl sobbing somewhere above him, the crowbar clattering to the ground as the reality of what he'd done crashed over him. "Oh God, oh Jesus, what did I do? What did I do?" Tom's last coherent thought was of Ranger, still trapped in the patrol car, and his trembling fingers found the emergency release button on his radio. The signal would open all the doors on his vehicle, freeing his partner to do what German shepherds had been bred to do for 1,000 years: protect their pack. Earl stared down at the deputy's still form, watching the blood spread like spilled paint across the forest floor. The uniform that had triggered his rage now looked pathetically ordinary, just fabric covering a man who was probably somebody's son, somebody's hope. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd become the very thing he'd always sworn to protect people from. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the unconscious form at his feet. "I'm so goddamn sorry." But sorry wouldn't stop the bleeding, and sorry wouldn't undo the moment when everything changed forever. Earl stumbled backward, then turned and crashed through the underbrush like a wounded animal, leaving behind another broken life to add to the collection he'd been accumulating since the night he'd let his daughter burn. In the distance, a sound rose above the whisper of wind through leaves, the deep, mournful howl of a dog who'd just lost everything that mattered. Ranger's cry carried across the hills like a prayer, like a promise, like a declaration of war against a world that kept taking away the things he loved. The forest fell silent, except for the wet sound of blood dripping onto autumn leaves and the fading echo of Earl Jackson's flight. Tom Mitchell lay still as death in a pool of his own blood, while somewhere in the distance, his partner's anguished howl announced that another good thing had been broken by the cruelty of men. The emergency release button worked exactly as designed, and Ranger shot from the patrol car like lightning given flesh and purpose. His powerful legs devoured the distance between the road and the forest, following a scent trail that told him everything he needed to know. His partner was hurt, bleeding, and alone. The German shepherd's training kicked in, but this wasn't about protocols or procedures anymore. This was about love distilled into its purest, most desperate form. He found Tom crumpled beneath the oak tree, surrounded by a pool of blood that looked black in the dappled forest light. Ranger's whine started low in his throat and built to something that sounded almost human in its anguish. He circled his fallen partner once, twice, his nose cataloging the damage. Severe head trauma, shallow breathing, pulse weak but present. Then he settled beside Tom's still form and began the vigil that would define the rest of his life. For 3 hours, Ranger maintained his watch. He licked the blood from Tom's face with gentle precision, his rough tongue cleaning the wound as best he could. Every few minutes he would place his paw on Tom's chest, checking for the reassuring rise and fall that meant life still flickered in the broken body. When the backup units finally arrived, following the GPS coordinates from Tom's emergency beacon, they found the dog positioned like a medieval knight guarding his fallen lord. "Jesus Christ," whispered Officer Danny Morrison, a 20-year veteran who'd seen his share of carnage but nothing quite like this. The sight of Ranger's amber eyes, bright with intelligence and fierce with protective love, would haunt his dreams for years to come. That dog's been keeping him alive through pure force of will. The helicopter ride to Vanderbilt Medical Center in Nashville passed in a blur of rotor noise and controlled chaos. Ranger rode in the cargo bay, his massive frame somehow fitting into the cramped space beside the gurney. The paramedics had tried to sedate him, but one look into those eyes had convinced them that the dog was more medicine than obstacle. His presence seemed to stabilize Tom's vital signs in ways that defied medical explanation. Martha Mitchell was arranging her prize-winning roses when the call came. The phone's shrill ring cut through the afternoon quiet like a blade, and somehow she knew before she answered that her world was about to end. The voice on the other end was kind but clinical, delivering words that hit her like physical blows. Head injury, helicopter, critical condition, next 48 hours will tell us everything. The coffee cup slipped from her weathered hands and shattered against the kitchen floor, brown liquid spreading across linoleum that had seen 40 years of family life. She stared at the broken pieces for a long moment, understanding in some primal way that this was how things broke, suddenly, completely, without warning or mercy. 2 hours later, Sarah Chen Mitchell was elbow-deep in surgery on a golden retriever when her phone buzzed with the message that would change everything. She read the text twice before the words penetrated her professional composure, then dropped her instruments and walked out of the operating room without a word of explanation to her stunned colleagues. The drive from Nashville to the hospital felt like swimming through honey, every mile stretched into eternity by anxiety and regret. Sarah's hands shook on the steering wheel as she thought about their last conversation, 3 months ago, when Tom had called to ask about Ranger's limp. They'd talked for an hour about nothing and everything, dancing around the feelings that still burned between them like embers in cold ashes. She found Martha in the ICU waiting room, looking smaller and more fragile than Sarah had ever seen her. The older woman's face crumpled when she saw her former daughter-in-law, and they fell into each other's arms without words. Whatever differences had driven Sarah away seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the possibility of losing Tom forever. "He's in surgery," Martha whispered against Sarah's shoulder. "Has been for 4 hours. They won't tell me anything except that it's bad. Real bad." Through the observation window they could see into the ICU where Ranger had somehow convinced the medical staff to let him stay. The dog lay beside Tom's bed like a living statue, his head resting on the edge of the mattress, his eyes fixed on his partner's still face. Every few minutes he would lift his massive head and sniff delicately at Tom's hand, checking for signs that only he could detect. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman emerged from surgery at 11 p.m., her scrubs stained with blood and her face etched with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting death for 6 straight hours. She pulled off her surgical cap as she approached the family, and Sarah's veterinary training read the signs before the doctor spoke. Successful surgery, but no guarantees. "We've removed a significant blood clot from his brain and relieved the pressure on his skull," Dr. Hartman explained, her voice carefully neutral. "The next 48 hours will be critical. He's in a medically induced coma to give his brain time to heal. But I won't lie to you, the injury was severe. We'll know more when we try to wake him up." Those first weeks passed in a haze of medical jargon and mounting bills. Martha moved into the hospital's family quarters, refusing to leave until her son opened his eyes. Sarah took indefinite leave from her practice, using her veterinary knowledge to translate the doctor's explanations for Martha and to advocate for Tom when the medical team seemed to forget he was a person, not just a case number. Ranger became something of a legend in the ICU. The nurses had never seen anything like his devotion. He refused food unless hand-fed, slept only in 10-minute intervals, and somehow seemed to know Tom's vital signs better than the machines. When Tom's blood pressure dropped, Ranger would whine softly and nuzzle his partner's hand. When infection threatened, the dog would become agitated hours before the fever spiked. "It's like he's monitoring him," whispered Nurse Patricia Webb, a 30-year veteran who'd seen every kind of family devotion imaginable. "I've never seen anything like it. That dog knows things about your son that our equipment can't measure." The financial reality hit them during the 3rd week. Insurance would cover the immediate medical expenses, but long-term care costs were mounting toward figures that would bankrupt a working family. Martha quietly began the process of taking a second mortgage on the family homestead, the house where she'd raised 5 children and buried 1 husband. Sarah liquidated her retirement savings and put her veterinary practice up for sale, Action she performed with the grim efficiency of someone who understood that money was just paper when measured against love. Day 47 dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of October morning that made Tennessee feel like the edge of the world. Martha was reading aloud from the Millbrook Gazette, sharing local gossip with her unconscious son the way she had every morning for 6 weeks. She was telling Tom about Mrs. Henderson's prize roses when his eyelids fluttered. Ranger's head snapped up instantly, his amber eyes fixed on Tom's face with laser intensity. A soft whine escaped his throat, different from the grieving sounds he'd been making for weeks. This was recognition, hope, pure joy distilled into canine music. "Tom?" Martha's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Baby, can you hear me?" Tom's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, but unmistakably alive. The first word he spoke was barely a whisper, but it carried across the room like a shout. "Ranger." The German Shepherd's response was immediate and overwhelming. His tail began wagging with such force that it knocked over a water pitcher, and he placed his massive paws on the bed rails, stretching up to lick his partner's face with the desperate affection of someone who'd been holding their breath for 47 days. "Good boy," Tom whispered, his voice hoarse from weeks of silence. "You stayed. You always stay." Dr. Hartman called it remarkable but cautioned against premature celebration. Tom's brain had suffered significant trauma, and recovery would be slow, incomplete, uncertain. There would be physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy. A mountain of work to rebuild a life that had been shattered by one moment of violence in the woods. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. Tom was awake, Ranger was ecstatic, and Martha was crying tears of gratitude that tasted like prayers answered. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the reunion she'd thought she'd never see, feeling something crack open in her chest that had been frozen solid for 2 years. The road ahead would be long and difficult, paved with small victories and crushing setbacks. But they would walk it together, all of them, bound by crisis into something stronger than blood, deeper than marriage, more permanent than vows. Love had brought Tom back from the edge of death, and love would carry them through whatever came next. Recovery was a cruel teacher that measured progress in millimeters and taught its lessons through grinding repetition. Tom's journey back to the world of the living began with the simplest things. Remembering his own name, recognizing his mother's face, understanding that the devoted dog beside his bed wasn't just a beautiful dream. The left side of his body felt like it belonged to someone else, and words that had once flowed easily now required conscious effort to construct. Physical therapy sessions became daily battles fought in a sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Ranger attended every session, positioning himself where Tom could see him, offering silent encouragement when the simplest tasks felt insurmountable. Walking 10 feet to the window became a marathon achievement. Lifting his left arm above his shoulder brought tears of frustration that had nothing to do with physical pain. "Don't push yourself so hard," Sarah would say during her daily visits, but Tom's stubborn pride wouldn't let him rest. He'd been the protector, the one people called when trouble came knocking. Now he needed help buttoning his shirt and remembering which day of the week it was. The role reversal felt like swallowing glass. Martha sold her wedding china to pay for private physical therapy, claiming she'd never liked the pattern anyway. She brought homemade soup every day, feeding Tom like he was 5 years old again, pretending not to notice when his hand shook so badly that half the broth ended up on his chest. Her own arthritis made the daily hospital trips an ordeal, but she bore the pain with the stoic endurance of a woman who'd buried one husband and refused to bury her son. By month 3, Tom could walk the length of the hospital corridor without assistance, though Ranger stayed close enough to provide support if needed. His speech had improved enough for complete conversations, and the doctors spoke cautiously of discharge plans. Insurance had approved a home health aide, and Martha's house had been modified with grab bars and wheelchair ramps that spoke of careful planning for an uncertain future. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who looked uncomfortable with his assignment. Earl Jackson had been arrested in Atlanta, caught stealing prescription painkillers from a pharmacy. During interrogation, the weight of his guilt had finally broken him, and he'd confessed to everything: the bank robbery, the assault, 5 years of running from ghosts that followed him everywhere. Tom read the letter 3 times, his undamaged right hand trembling with emotions he couldn't name. Earl's handwriting was cramped and desperate, the words of a man pouring out his soul to someone he'd nearly killed. "I know you got no reason to read this and less reason to believe it, but I need you to know that hitting you was the worst thing I ever done, and I done plenty of bad things. I ain't making excuses, but I lost my little girl Katie in a fire 5 years back, and seeing that uniform just brought it all back. The cops were chasing me that night when I crashed and she died, and I blame them for everything that went wrong in my life. But it wasn't their fault. It was mine, all mine, and I've been running from that truth ever since." The letter went on for 3 pages, describing a man's descent into hell and his desperate attempts to climb back out. Earl wrote about living rough in the mountains, about stealing flowers for his daughter's grave, about the whiskey that helped him sleep but couldn't stop the nightmares. He wrote about the moment after he'd struck Tom, when he'd realized he'd become the monster he'd always fought against. "I called 911 from a payphone after I run off," the letter continued. "Told them where to find you. It don't make what I done right, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to help. I'm in jail now, and I reckon that's where I belong. But I wanted you to know that hurting you wasn't about you. It was about me being broken and too proud to ask for help." Sarah found Tom sitting by the window, the letter clutched in his good hand, tears streaming down his face. She'd seen him cry twice since the attack. Once, when he'd forgotten his own mother's name, and once when he'd realized he might never be able to return to police work. This was different. This was the grief of a man confronting the senseless cruelty of a world where good people got hurt by other good people who'd simply been broken beyond their ability to cope. "He lost his daughter," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. 8 years old. He was just a father who couldn't save his little girl. The revelation changed something fundamental in Tom's understanding of what had happened to him. The attack hadn't been about evil or malice. It had been about pain so profound that it had driven a decent man to desperate acts. Earl Jackson wasn't a monster. He was a cautionary tale about what happened when grief went untreated and guilt became a poison that destroyed everything it touched. Recovery took on new meaning after that. Tom's progress accelerated, driven not just by the desire to regain his old life, but by a growing understanding that healing was possible, even after the most devastating wounds. He began writing letters back to Earl, awkward at first due to his motor skills, but filled with a forgiveness that surprised everyone, including himself. The breakthrough came during month 4, when Tom managed to walk from the hospital entrance to the parking lot without stopping to rest. Ranger trotted beside him, tail wagging with pride, occasionally bumping against Tom's good leg as if to say, "I told you so." The October air felt different against Tom's skin. Sharper, more alive, full of possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Plans for discharge became concrete as November arrived. Martha's house had been transformed into a recovery center, with a hospital bed installed in Tom's childhood bedroom and a physical therapy area set up in the den where he'd once played with action figures and dreamed of becoming a hero. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was returning to the place where his dreams had been born, hoping to rebuild a life that had been shattered while living those dreams. Sarah's visits had become the highlight of his days, though neither of them acknowledged the growing tension between them. She would sit beside his bed, reading veterinary journals while he dozed, or help him with his physical therapy exercises, her professional knowledge making her the perfect assistant. But there were moments when their hands touched while she helped him stand, or when she laughed at one of his weak jokes, that felt charged with possibilities neither dared to explore. The medical team was cautiously optimistic about Tom's long-term prognosis. He would likely regain most of his physical capabilities, though fine motor control might always be impaired. His cognitive function had recovered remarkably well, with only occasional memory lapses and some difficulty with complex problem-solving. He would never be the same man who'd entered those woods 6 months ago, but he might become someone better, someone who understood the fragility of life and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Discharge day was set for December 1st, exactly 7 months after the attack. Tom would go home with an arsenal of medications, a strict therapy schedule, and a German Shepherd who'd proven that loyalty was stronger than death. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer terrifying, filled with the kind of ordinary miracles that had seemed impossible when his world was measured in heartbeats and breathing tubes. As Tom prepared to leave the hospital that had been his world for so long, he realized that he wasn't the same man who'd been carried in bleeding and broken. The attack had taken away his old life, but it had given him something precious in return. A deeper understanding of what truly mattered, and the knowledge that love in all its forms was the only force strong enough to heal a broken world. December arrived with a warmth that fooled the dogwoods into blooming early, their white petals scattered across Martha's yard like promises of better days ahead. Tom's homecoming had been everything the family could have hoped for. Tears, laughter, and Ranger spinning in circles with joy at having his pack reunited under one roof. For 3 weeks, the rhythm of recovery had felt almost normal. Physical therapy sessions in the converted den, family dinners around Martha's kitchen table, and evenings spent on the front porch watching the sun set over the Tennessee hills. Tom had even begun to hope. The doctors spoke of returning to light duty within 6 months, maybe desk work at first, but still police work. Sarah's visits had become daily occurrences, and sometimes she would stay for dinner, the 3 of them plus Ranger forming the kind of family circle that had existed only in Tom's dreams during the dark months of recovery. Her laughter filled spaces in the house that had been empty for too long, and Martha had started setting an extra place at the table without being asked. On December 22nd, exactly 7 months and 15 days after Earl Jackson's crowbar had shattered his skull, Tom Mitchell woke up feeling like himself for the first time since the attack. His left hand closed into a fist without conscious effort. His mind felt sharp and clear, and when he looked in the bathroom mirror, he saw not a victim, but a survivor. He made coffee using both hands, scrambled eggs without dropping the pan, and even managed to whistle while he worked. "You're in a good mood this morning," Martha observed, settling into her chair with the kind of careful movements that reminded Tom how much his mother had aged during his recovery. Her arthritis had worsened from sleeping in hospital chairs and stress eating cafeteria food, but she never complained. She was just grateful to have her boy home. "Feels like Christmas came early," Tom replied, scratching behind Ranger's ears as the dog leaned against his legs. "Think I might even wrap presents this year without needing help." Sarah arrived around noon with a pot of her grandmother's famous chili and news that made the whole house feel brighter. "I found a buyer for my Nashville practice," she announced, trying to sound casual about a decision that would change everything. "Thought I might open something smaller here in Millbrook. You know, serve the local farmers, maybe do some large animal work." The words hung in the air like Christmas ornaments, beautiful and fragile and full of possibility. Tom felt his heart do something it hadn't done in months. It skipped with hope, with the dangerous joy of a man who'd learned that happiness could be stolen in an instant, but was willing to risk loving it anyway. "Good to see you up and about, Deputy," called out Mabel from Martha's diner, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. "Saved you a piece of pecan pie with extra ice cream." "Ranger, you beautiful beast," laughed Father Mackenzie, the parish priest who'd led prayer services during Tom's darkest hours. "I always knew you'd bring our boy home safe." The warmth of community support wrapped around them like a blanket, and for the first time since the attack, Tom felt like he belonged somewhere again. He wasn't just a victim, or a patient, or a man learning to walk again. He was Deputy Sheriff Tom Mitchell, and these people were his to protect and serve. They were walking past the courthouse when Tom felt the first stirrings of something wrong. It started as a slight dizziness, the kind that might come from too much excitement or not enough sleep. Then his vision began to blur around the edges, and words became difficult to form. He reached out for Sarah's arm, trying to communicate that something was happening, but his hand wouldn't obey his brain's commands. "Tom?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she was standing right beside him. "Tom, what's wrong?" The seizure hit like a freight train made of lightning and broken glass. Tom's body went rigid, then began convulsing with violent spasms that dropped him to the sidewalk in front of half the town. His head struck the concrete with a sound that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come, and foam began forming at the corners of his mouth as his brain misfired in ways that defied every prayer Martha had ever whispered. Ranger's response was immediate and overwhelming. The German shepherd's howl rose above the sounds of the seizure, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to contain every loss he'd ever suffered. He positioned himself over Tom's convulsing form, protecting him from the gathering crowd while his amber eyes searched desperately for some way to fix what was broken. "Call 911, Sarah shouted, her veterinary training kicking in as she tried to protect Tom's airway and prevent him from biting his tongue. But even as she performed the mechanical actions of emergency care, she could see the truth in his eyes during the brief moments when the seizure allowed consciousness to flicker through. This wasn't a minor setback or a temporary complication. This was the beginning of something much worse. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. Tom's seizure had lasted nearly 10 minutes, far longer than was safe, and when it finally ended, he didn't return to consciousness. His breathing was labored and irregular, his pulse was weak and thready, and the monitors showed brain activity that made the paramedics exchange grim looks over his still form. During the frantic ride back to Vanderbilt Medical Center, Sarah held Martha's hand while Ranger maintained his vigil beside the gurney. The Christmas lights of Nashville blurred past the ambulance windows like fallen stars, and the joy that had filled their evening turned to ash in their mouths. 7 months of progress, 7 months of hope and healing and learning to live again, and it could all be stolen away by the random firing of damaged neurons in a brain that had been pushed too far. "He was doing so well," Martha whispered, her voice breaking on words that felt like prayers offered to an indifferent God. He was finally himself again. But even as hope died in the back of that ambulance, Ranger's eyes never left his partner's face. The dog's devotion burned steady as a lighthouse beam, unwavering in its certainty that love was stronger than medicine, more powerful than probability, more enduring than the cruel mathematics of traumatic brain injury. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The emergency room at Vanderbilt Medical Center buzzed with controlled chaos as Tom's gurney disappeared behind swinging doors that might as well have been the gates of hell. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the same neurosurgeon who'd saved his life 7 months earlier, emerged from her Christmas Eve dinner to meet a nightmare she'd hoped never to see again. Her face, usually composed and professional, cracked when she saw the monitors displaying Tom's vital signs. "Massive brain hemorrhage," she announced to the trauma team, her voice steady despite the sinking feeling in her chest. "Same location as the original injury. The scar tissue must have weakened over time." She didn't say what everyone in the room was thinking, that sometimes the brain simply couldn't handle the stress of healing. That recovery was a cruel illusion that could be snatched away without warning. In the surgical suite, Doc Hartman emerged just as Christmas morning was painting the sky pale pink, her scrubs stained with blood and her face etched with exhaustion that went bone deep. She pulled off her surgical mask as she approached the family, and Sarah's heart sank at the expression in the surgeon's eyes. "We've controlled the bleeding," Dr. Hartman began, choosing her words with the care of someone delivering a death sentence. "But the damage this time is extensive, much more severe than his original injury. He's in a coma, and honestly, I'm not optimistic about his chances of waking up." The words hit Martha like physical blows. She doubled over in her chair, a keening sound escaping her throat that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Sarah knelt beside the older woman, wrapping her arms around shoulders that shook with grief too profound for tears. "How long?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If there's no improvement in the next 24 hours, doctor." Hartman's voice trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, especially not today." They moved Tom to the ICU, where he lay surrounded by machines that breathed for him and monitored vital signs that grew progressively weaker as Christmas Day wore on. His face, peaceful in the artificial sleep of medical coma, looked like a stranger's. The man who'd climbed stepladders and walked Christmas light tours was gone, replaced by someone whose existence depended entirely on the mercy of computers and the stubborn refusal of his family to let go. Ranger took up his familiar position beside the bed, but something was different this time. Where before he'd been vigilant and hopeful, now he seemed resigned, as if he understood that this battle was different from the first one. He rested his grizzled muzzle on the edge of the mattress and settled into a vigil that felt more like a wake. The hours crawled by with the cruel slowness of a clock counting down to execution. Martha held Tom's hand and told him stories about his childhood, about the Christmas mornings, when he'd wake the whole house at dawn to see what Santa had brought. Sarah read to him from the Millbrook Gazette, sharing local gossip and news about neighbors who were praying for his recovery. But Tom's face remained slack, his breathing entirely dependent on the ventilator that hissed and wheezed beside his bed. By evening, the medical team was discussing end-of-life care. Tom's brain activity had continued to decline throughout the day, and the specialists agreed that further intervention would only prolong suffering without offering any realistic hope of recovery. Dr. Hartman approached the family with the gentleness of someone who'd delivered this kind of news too many times. "His brain function is minimal," she explained, her voice soft with compassion. "The machines are keeping his body alive, but Tom isn't really there anymore. We need to discuss your options." The decision to withdraw life support wasn't made lightly or quickly. It took hours of agonized discussion, phone calls to family members who sobbed their agreement through long-distance connections, and consultations with Father Mackenzie, who drove down from Millbrook to offer whatever comfort his presence could provide. "He wouldn't want to live like this," Martha said finally, her voice barely recognizable through the weight of her grief. "My boy was always about living, not just existing. If he can't come back to us, if he can't really come back." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the knot of sorrow that had lodged in her throat. She'd seen this decision made countless times in her veterinary practice, but it felt entirely different when the patient was someone you loved, someone whose life had been intertwined with your own in ways both beautiful and complicated. Dr. Hartman scheduled the withdrawal of life support for 11:30 p.m., giving the family time to say their goodbyes and gather whatever closure could be found in such circumstances. One by one, Tom's colleagues from the sheriff's department filed through the ICU to pay their respects. Old friends from high school, neighbors from Millbrook, and even former patients Tom had helped during his 20 years of service came to bid farewell to a man who dedicated his life to protecting others. At 11:25 p.m., Dr. Hartman entered the room and began the process of disconnecting the machines that had kept Tom's body functioning. Hartman checked for a pulse, examined his pupils with a penlight, and made the pronouncement that transformed Tom Mitchell from patient to memory. Time of death, 11:54 p.m., December 25th. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Martha's quiet sobbing and Sarah's whispered prayers. But Ranger's reaction was different this time. Instead of the mournful howl that had marked Tom's first injury, the German shepherd rose to his feet and approached the head of the bed with purposeful deliberation. He sniffed intently at Tom's face, his nose working with the precision of an instrument calibrated to detect things human senses couldn't measure. Then he moved to Tom's wrist, pressing his wet nose against the pulse point with the intensity of a dog who'd spent 7 months learning to read the subtlest signs of life in his beloved partner. A low whine escaped Ranger's throat, but it wasn't the sound of grief. It was the sound of confusion, of a highly trained detection dog encountering something that didn't match his expectations. He placed his massive paw on Tom's chest just over the heart that had supposedly stopped beating forever. And then, impossible as sunrise in the middle of night, Ranger began to growl. Hospital security was already reaching for their radios when Sarah held up a hand to stop them. "Wait," she said, her veterinary training suddenly clicking into place as she watched Ranger's behavior. "He's not just grieving. Look at what he's doing." Ranger's nose was pressed against Tom's wrist, his nostrils flaring as he sampled scents that human perception couldn't detect. Every few seconds, he would lift his massive head and place his ear against Tom's chest, listening with the focused intensity of a dog who'd spent months learning to monitor his partner's vital signs better than any machine. "Sarah, honey," Martha whispered, her voice broken with exhaustion and grief. "The doctors have done everything they can. We have to let him go." But Sarah was watching Ranger with the clinical eye of someone who'd spent years observing animal behavior. The dog's actions weren't random or emotional. They were methodical, purposeful, the behavior of a detection dog who'd found something that didn't match expectations. German shepherds were bred for intelligence and trained for precision. Ranger wasn't confused about death. He was insisting that death hadn't actually occurred. "Dr. Hartman," Sarah said slowly, her voice carrying the authority of professional expertise. "In veterinary medicine, we see something called Lazarus syndrome, temporary cessation of cardiac activity that can mimic death. It's rare, but it happens. What if Ranger is detecting something our equipment missed?" Dr. Hartman's expression shifted from patience to professional interest. She'd heard of Lazarus syndrome, of course, every medical professional had. But it was so rare that most doctors went their entire careers without encountering a case. The syndrome could cause apparent death for minutes or even hours before spontaneous recovery occurred. "The monitors showed a clear flat line," Dr. Hartman said, but she was already moving toward Tom's bedside, her scientific curiosity overriding her certainty. "There's no heartbeat, no brain activity, no respiratory function." Ranger's response was to press his nose more firmly against Tom's wrist, then look up at the doctor with eyes that seemed to burn with frustrated intelligence. The message was clear as spoken words. "You're wrong. Check again. Don't give up on him." Young Dr. Amanda Foster, a resident who'd been observing from the doorway, stepped forward with the courage of someone too new to medicine to be intimidated by established protocols. "What if we brought in an EEG machine, just to double-check for any minimal brain activity?" The suggestion hung in the air like a prayer offered by someone afraid to hope. Martha looked up from her son's still form, her eyes red with tears but suddenly bright with something that might have been possibility. Sarah moved closer to Tom's bed, her hand finding his shoulder as if she could will life back into his body through sheer force of love. "It couldn't hurt to be thorough," Dr. Foster continued, her voice gaining confidence. "I mean, if the dog is detecting something we're missing, shouldn't we investigate? These K9 units are trained to detect things human senses can't perceive." Dr. Hartman hesitated for a moment, torn between medical certainty and the nagging doubt that came from 20 years of practicing medicine in a field where absolute certainty was often an illusion. Finally, she nodded to Dr. Foster. "Bring in the portable EEG and get me a more sensitive cardiac monitor. If this dog is right, I want to know." The next 20 minutes felt like 20 hours as the medical team set up equipment with the methodical precision of scientists conducting an experiment that could rewrite everything they thought they knew about death. Ranger maintained his protective stance throughout, occasionally allowing the technicians to attach electrodes, but never moving far from Tom's side. The EEG machine hummed to life, its screen displaying the kind of flat lines that had become grimly familiar over the past day. But Dr. Foster leaned closer, adjusting the sensitivity settings with the thoroughness of someone who understood that miracles often hid in the smallest details. "There," she whispered, pointing to tiny fluctuations in the readout that were barely visible above the baseline. "Those aren't equipment errors. That's minimal brain activity. Barely perceptible but definitely present." Dr. Hartman moved to examine the cardiac monitor, which had been calibrated to detect the faintest heartbeats. For several minutes, nothing appeared on the screen except the flat line that had pronounced Tom's death. Then, so faint it could have been mistaken for electrical interference, a small blip appeared. "Jesus, Doctor." Hartman breathed, her professional composure cracking as she watched the impossible unfold before her eyes. "There's a heartbeat. Extremely weak, maybe 6 beats per minute, but it's there." The room erupted in controlled chaos as the medical team sprang into action with the efficiency of people who'd been given a second chance at performing a miracle. Oxygen was administered through a manual respirator, medications were prepared to support cardiac function, and monitoring equipment was fine-tuned to track vital signs that existed at the very threshold of life. Ranger's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. His tail began wagging with such force that it knocked over a water pitcher, and he pressed his nose against Tom's hand with the gentle insistence of a dog who'd never doubted that his partner was still fighting somewhere in the darkness. The low whine that escaped his throat was pure joy, the sound of a faithful guardian who'd been vindicated in his refusal to give up hope. How is this possible?" Martha asked, her voice wandering between laughter and tears as she watched her son's chest begin to rise and fall with the assistance of the respirator. "How did we miss this?" "Locked-in syndrome," Dr. Hartman explained, her voice filled with the awe of someone witnessing medical history. "It's a condition where the patient is conscious but unable to move or speak due to paralysis of nearly all voluntary muscles. They can think, they can hear, they can feel, but they appear to be in a coma or even dead." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Tom had locked-in syndrome, he'd been conscious throughout their goodbyes, had heard every word of love and farewell they'd whispered over his still form. He'd been trapped in his own body, aware but unable to respond, while they'd prepared to let him die. "So he heard us?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face as she took Tom's hand in both of hers. "He heard everything we said." Over the next hour, Tom's vital signs slowly strengthened under careful medical support. His heartbeat became more regular, his brain activity showed increased amplitude, and subtle changes in his facial expressions suggested that consciousness was fighting its way back to the surface. Ranger never left his side, occasionally placing his paw on Tom's chest as if checking to make sure his partner was still improving. At 2:17 a.m. on December 26th, exactly 2 hours and 23 minutes after he'd been pronounced dead, Tom Mitchell coughed. It was a small sound, barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. But it might as well have been thunder for the way it electrified everyone in the room. Martha was beside his bed in an instant, her hands hovering over his face as if she were afraid he might disappear if she touched him. "Tommy. Baby, can you hear me?" Tom's eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly to reveal eyes that were unfocused but unmistakably alive. His gaze found Ranger first, just as it had during his first awakening months before, and his lips moved in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with more love than all the prayers that had been offered in his name. "You stayed. You always stay." Dr. Hartman would later tell news reporters that she'd witnessed one of the rarest medical phenomena in existence, a case of Lazarus syndrome complicated by locked-in syndrome that had been detected not by advanced medical equipment, but by a dog whose devotion had transcended the boundaries between life and death. The medical journals would study Tom's case for years, but they would never be able to explain how Ranger had known what the machines couldn't detect. In that moment, though, none of the medical explanations mattered. What mattered was that love had refused to accept defeat, that loyalty had proven stronger than death, and that sometimes the greatest miracles came on 4 legs with amber eyes and an unbreakable bond to the humans they chose to protect. 6 months after the miracle that had stunned the medical world, Tom Mitchell stood on the front porch of his childhood home, watching the Tennessee sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. His recovery had been slow but steady, each day bringing back pieces of the man he used to be, while creating something entirely new. The headaches still came sometimes, and his left hand would never be quite as steady as before, but he was alive, and that was more than anyone had dared to hope. Ranger lay beside his chair, the German shepherd's graying muzzle resting peacefully on crossed paws. The dog who had defied death itself now seemed content to spend his days in quiet companionship, though his amber eyes still held that uncanny intelligence that had saved Tom's life twice over. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, her wedding ring catching the last rays of sunlight. They'd remarried in a simple ceremony at Martha's house, with Ranger serving as ring-bearer and the entire town of Millbrook in attendance. Martha rocked gently in her chair, knitting booties for the grandchild that would arrive in spring, a new beginning born from the ashes of tragedy. "Sometimes angels have 4 legs," Tom whispered, scratching behind Ranger's ears as peace settled over them like a benediction. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.